Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about an interesting question, which is the order that the Gospels were written. Now, it might seem like it's not necessary to know the order that the Gospels were written in order to understand the Gospels or understand the history behind the Gospels, but actually knowing the order that the Gospels were written lays the foundation for the rest of Gospel studies, because every time you encounter a story in one of the Gospels that appears in the other Gospels as well, you want to be able to know which version of the story came first and then how the later versions changed the story so that you can get back to the earliest layers of Gospel tradition and so that you can understand the different theological emphases of the different Gospel authors by how they changed the earlier version. Fortunately, there are clues inside the Gospels themselves that show the order the Gospels were written, and so today I'm going to be walking us through these clues so that you can know the actual reasons that scholars think the Gospels were written in the order of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. The obvious starting point when looking at the order the Gospels were written is finding out which Gospel was written first. Thankfully, I've already covered this topic in this video here, in which I give the reasons for thinking that Mark is the first Gospel that was written, and that Matthew and Luke were both using Mark when they were writing their Gospels. And then in this video here, I dealt with the question of whether or not Matthew and Luke knew the other person's gospel, whether Matthew knew Luke's gospel or Luke knew Matthew's gospel, or if they were both relying on an outside source called Q, which is where they got the material that they share. And I gave my reasons for thinking that either Matthew knew Luke or Luke knew Matthew, but they weren't relying on an outside source called Q for the traditions that they share, but that they don't get from Mark. And so the next question when dealing with the order the Gospels were written is figuring out, did Matthew use Luke or did Luke use Matthew? And so that's where we'll pick up today with this video. I'm going to be arguing for the view that the majority of scholars hold, which is that it was Matthew and then Luke and then John. So I think the order of the Gospels is Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, and then John. And so I'll start by giving my reasons for thinking that Luke used Matthew rather than Matthew using Luke. And so I think the most powerful argument for showing that Luke used Matthew rather than Matthew using Luke is an argument called editorial fatigue. This argument was developed by Mark Goodacre in his article, Fatigue in the Synoptics. Dr. Mark Goodacre developed this idea, which is that when one author, let's say his name is Jimmy, uses another author's work, let's say Sarah's work, Jimmy will make some changes to Sarah's work, but inevitably we'll be able to detect that he has made changes because they won't necessarily fit perfectly with the way that Sarah originally wrote a story. So if he's copying down a story from Sarah and he decides to change the wording a little bit in the beginning of the story, he might not continue making changes throughout the rest of the story to make his earlier changes fit. And if he doesn't, then it'll betray the fact that Sarah wrote her story first, because Jimmy's story will be less coherent when you compare the beginning to the end than Sarah's story. So we have some instances of this in the way that Luke used Matthew. So if you look at Luke 9, 4, and 5, Jesus is giving commands to the disciples that he is sending out into the surrounding cities to evangelize. And Luke says, "And whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave from there. And as for all who do not receive you, when you leave that town, shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them." Interestingly, Jesus mentions them entering a house, but he never mentions the disciples entering a town. And so then when he says, "when you leave that town," the obvious question that the reader is left with is, what town? But if we look over at Matthew's version of Jesus' statement, Matthew actually has Jesus introduce both the town and the house. In Matthew 10:11, Jesus says, "In whatever town or village you enter, inquire who is worthy in it and stay at his house until you leave." And then in verse 14, he says, "And whoever does not receive you or listen to your words, as you leave that house or town, shake the dust off your feet." And so when you look over at Luke's version of the story, you can see that he was using Matthew, but Luke left out Matthew's mention of the town and only mentioned entering the house because he's trying to shorten Matthew's story a little bit, make the plot progress a little quicker. And so it leaves you wondering, why is Jesus mentioning a town later on when he never mentioned that the disciples were entering a town? There's an even more clear example of editorial fatigue in the parable of the talents. So Jesus tells a parable about a master who goes out of town, but before he goes out of town, he gives 3 servants some talents, which are a type of money. And so he gives the first servant 5 talents, and he gives the second servant 2 talents, and he gives the third servant 1 talent. And then the master goes on a journey. When he comes back, he asks the servants what they did with the talents. And the first servant, who was given 5 talents, had invested the talents and made 5 more. And then the master says to him, "You are faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things." The second servant invested his 2 talents and made 2 more. And so the master says, "I will put you in charge of many things." But the third servant did not invest it. Instead, he hid it away, and he didn't make any new talents with his talent. And so the master says to him, "Therefore, take the talent away from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents." Luke then takes this parable in Matthew and makes some key changes to it in a way that makes the parable a lot more confusing. So first of all, when the master leaves, instead of giving money to 3 servants, it says that he gave 1 mina, so he's changing it from a talent to a mina, a different kind of money, but he gives 1 mina to 10 different servants each. And so then you expect that the master, when he returns, he's going to talk to all 10 servants, but no, he follows Matthew and only talks to the 3 servants. So it makes you wonder what happened to the other 7 servants that he gave a mina to. Second of all, when the master is rewarding the 2 good servants, instead of saying, "I will put you in charge of many things," he says to the first one, "I will put you over 10 cities." And to the second one, he says, "You are to be over 5 cities." So he's actually giving them cities as a reward for growing the number of minas. This makes it very anticlimactic at the end when he says to the third servant, "Take the mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas." Because getting an extra coin is not a big deal if you've just been given 10 cities. And so the story becomes kind of anticlimactic, whereas in Matthew, it actually makes a lot more sense since the master did not clarify how much he was giving them as a reward. He just said, "I will put you in charge of many things." A third change that Luke makes to Matthew is that in Matthew, the master had given 5 talents to the first servant and he made 5 more. Whereas in Luke, he had given him 1 talent and he made 10 more. So the difference between these two is that in Matthew, the final tally is that the first servant has 10 coins, whereas in Luke, the final tally is 11 because he started with 1 and he made 10 more, so now he has 11. This makes it a little bit confusing at the end in Luke when the master says, "Take the mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas," because he doesn't actually have 10 minas, he has 11. And therefore, these 3 changes that Luke makes to Matthew each make the story a little bit more confusing. And so it's clear that Matthew's version of the story was the original version and that Luke made some changes at the beginning of the story, but he didn't consistently change to the rest of the story to fit with those changes that he made. And therefore it betrays the fact that Luke's version of the story is later and that Matthew's version of the story is earlier. Therefore, it is clear that Matthew was written first and that Luke was written after Matthew using Matthew. Now that we know the order of the first 3 Gospels, that it was Mark written first and then Matthew and then Luke, the question becomes, what about John? How do we know that John wasn't written before any of the Gospels, or maybe Luke was written after John, so why wasn't it Mark, Matthew, John, Luke? How do we know that John is the last Gospel? The way that we know that John is the last Gospel to be written is that John often assumes his readers already know information from the other Gospels. And so he doesn't specifically rehash the same information because he knows they've read the other Gospels. And so he just kind of leaves it understood that some of the events from the other Gospels happened without actually explaining these events to the readers. So let me give you a few examples. In John 3, 23 and 24, it says, "Now John was also baptizing in Aenon near Salem because there was an abundance of water there and people were coming and being baptized, for John had not yet been thrown into prison." The Gospel of John assumes the readers know that John the Baptist ends up being thrown into prison because he says John hadn't yet been thrown into prison. But John, interestingly, is the only gospel that never narrates John the Baptist being thrown into prison. John is assuming that the readers of his gospel have already read the other gospels, and so that they already know about John the Baptist being thrown into a prison. Another time that John assumes his readers are familiar with material from the other gospels is when John describes Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb of Jesus and finding that the stone has already been rolled away. But interestingly, John, unlike the other Gospels, has never actually narrated a stone being rolled in front of the tomb. And so he's assuming his readers already know this detail, even though he's never actually described it, which shows that John is being written after the other Gospels. But why couldn't John only have been written after Mark and Matthew, but not written after Luke? How do we know that John was written after Luke as well? Well, Mark Goodacre actually pointed me to a detail at the beginning of John 11 that shows that John was written after Luke. So John 11, 1 and 2 read, "Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick." Interestingly, while Matthew, Mark, and Luke all describe the anointing of Jesus, only Luke describes the woman wiping Jesus' feet with her hair. And therefore, by pointing that out, it seems that he is assuming a detail from Luke. But an interesting thing is, John has not actually narrated the anointing yet. And so he's expecting his readers are aware of the anointing, even though he hasn't mentioned it yet in his gospel. When he says Mary is the one who anointed Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, he expects his readers are already aware of that story, and the only place that that story happens with those specific descriptions is in the Gospel of Luke. Also, when he says a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, he's introducing Lazarus as a new character that the readers are not aware of by saying a certain man was sick. This is because John is the only gospel that actually talks about the character Lazarus. But then he says the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And so John is expecting his readers to be aware of who Mary and Martha are. But Luke is the only gospel other than John that mentions Mary and Martha. Since none of the other gospels mention Lazarus, John introduces him as if he's a new character. And therefore, if John expects his readers to be aware of the Gospel of Luke, which talks about Mary and Martha, this would mean that Luke was written before John. Since Luke was the last of the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to be written, this would mean that John is written after all three of the synoptic Gospels and therefore is the last Gospel in the Bible to be written.